Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. We have a couple of very interesting topics today. I want to begin with the 4060, specifically some official benchmarks and performance information from Nvidia themselves. And we're going to talk about the PlayStation 6. Now, Sony have actually put out some very interesting comments with this whole court case that's going on at the moment with, of course, Activision Blizzard merger. And they have basically said that they're not too keen about sharing PS6 information. So we're going to get to that in just a moment. But let's begin with the 4060. So this card is going to launch later this month, specifically on the 29th, and it's going to cost you $300. So it will be essentially, well, $100 cheaper than the RTX 4060 Ti. And obviously, Nvidia are very keen to push technology like DLSS 3 because, well, it's basically a performance multiplier. And of course, this means that they have separated performance categories into two: games with and without AI frame generation. So, for example, if you own a 3060, then you cannot use DLSS 3, you're relegated to just DLSS 2, same as if you have like an RTX 20 series card. But obviously, these RTX 40 GPUs, they all support frame generation, which basically is quite nice in a lot of games. I've been using it quite a lot with my 1490, and I do think it does fairly good in certain titles. It's still not perfect. I suspect the technology, just like anything, is going to continue to evolve, and I'm very curious to see what AMD does with FSR3. A lot of folks are wondering when that's going to get released. I've heard it's going to be late summer, but it could get pushed back because, well, yeah, AMD themselves haven't given a very exactly great amount of information of it, and honestly, my sources have been a little quiet on FSR3, so I'll be very curious to see how it compares in both visual quality and performance versus the Nvidia equivalents. Anyway, so the 29th and $300, and what does this actually get you? Well, basically speaking, if you compare the 3060 versus the 4060, we're seeing a 20% increase in performance, but in titles which do feature frame generation, for example, Witcher 3, Spider-Man, Miles Morales, as well as I believe the original one, Cyberpunk, so on and so on and so on, then you get a significant bump in performance. However, without frame generation, then it's around a 20% bump. Now that honestly is not huge. And here's the thing, I could go on a whole tangent of this, and I'm not going to bore you for like, 5-10 minutes about this in this specific video, but here's the thing, guys, like, and I'm very curious to hear your opinion. This is not bad. Like, if you do not own an RTX card, it's not bad. The performance is not awful. The two negatives of this is, first of all, it's not a big jump over the 3060 or even the 2060, to be very honest. And also, it's going to be very interesting to see how this scales with textures and all this other stuff, especially since L2 has also been cut. But if you recall, back in the day, and I do feel like I'm like 100 when I say something like that, but I remember when cards like do you remember the GTX 960 to the 1060? Like, that was an absurd increase in performance. That was massive. Or even the 760 to the 960, it was okay. You sometimes get these like huge increases, and other times not so much. So I'm going to be very interested to see how the market receives this. The RX, AMD are certainly just as culpable. In cards like the RX 7600, again, it's not a bad card. It's just not that much faster than the previous card, and it's not like, if this, let's say for the sake of argument, if this card cost like $200 and it was 20% faster than the 3060, oh boy, you bet your bottom dollar I'd be saying, I'd literally, like, I'd give Jensen a kiss on the forehead and say that you're my favorite human. But it's incremental. And this is, again, not to say it's a bad product, because ultimately Nvidia, AMD, they generally speaking think that you're going to upgrade every couple of generations. So it's going to be very interesting to see what, let's say, the RTX 5060 is going to be capable of. I will be hopefully putting up a video in the next couple of days with some rumors, specifically on the mid-range for that, because I've been hearing some interesting stuff. So I was actually going to put up the RTX 50 video either yesterday or maybe today or tomorrow, but just from the fact that I was sick a lot last week, it basically meant that a couple of my sources, I'm still trying to get back to them on a few things and cross some, T's and dot some I's and all of that stuff. stuff. So that will be coming pretty soon. But there is some good news on the horizon, I think, especially from Intel as well. But let's switch our focus from Nvidia and now talk about the PlayStation 6, specifically Jim Ryan and his deposition back in April. Now, I have not been following the Activision Blizzard case super tightly, because honestly there's just so much happening, and there's so much toing and froing from both companies. But here's the thing, Jim Ryan basically said that if Microsoft acquire Activision, Sony will not choose to share information regarding the PlayStation 6 with the developers, and they will not be able to share relevant future console info to the developer owned by a competitor. Now, here's the thing with that. That's a very interesting statement, but obviously that essentially means that they will not get COD if that was the case. But of course they eventually mean that once the console becomes publicly available, they will do that. But it's a very interesting one. I can definitely understand it from Sony's perspective, and there's a lot I could say about this, but you also have situations where, of course, Minecraft is already there, so there could have been some leaks from that, and obviously Minecraft is on the PS5. But you also have the fact that, let's say, Destiny is owned by Bungie, so what if Destiny 3 comes out? What happens there with the Xbox? Or Major League Baseball, is it? I think that's a Sony-owned studio. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I just remembered that off the top of my head. But yeah, so it's a very interesting situation, and leaks can happen in various different ways. For example, Capcom could leak it, AMD could leak it, and I can tell you guys that I don't go to conferences super amounts, but every time I have learned something under the table. Sometimes I'm not allowed to say it in a video, other times I am, but yeah, that stuff actually does kind of get said, and people get drunk, or they just let their guard down, or they don't realize someone's standing over their shoulder or something like that. With all of that said, however, I would totally understand Sony, for example, not wanting to go up to, let's say, Activision Blizzard if the merger did go through during early talks about the hardware. For example, Sony typically will work alongside developers and essentially ask them pain points. For example, what were your pain points with the PlayStation 3 when the PS4 was being developed? So obviously a lot of people complained about the difficulty of working with a sole processor and all of that stuff, which is why Sony back in the day talked a lot about, if you go back to the I think it was the Road to PS4 event. I can't remember, maybe. It was basically when the PS4 got first announced. And Sony was talking a lot about time to pixel, i.e. the amount of time it takes for developers to do something, write code, get something that basically produces an image on screen. And back on the PS1, it was not as long, and then it became longer on the PS2 and much longer on the PS3. So that was a pain point. And, they also did, of course, the same for the PS4 to PS5, one of the big ones, and Microsoft, I'm sure, in fact, I'm pretty damn certain they also spoke to developers. I think I remember them saying this in an interview, that one of the big pain points with developers is the slow-ass drives, the mechanical drives of the PS4 or the Xbox One. So obviously these conversations are entered into, and developers can improve, because obviously you can't just create your system in a bubble. You need feedback. So these developers, their direct feedback improves the console, and obviously we get better games as a result. And it's going to be very interesting, because obviously when you have the feedback from, let's say, Nvidia, a lot of these ecosystems are really tied together, and I could again get in quite a long spiel about this, but you have, like, for example, AMD working on graphics and CPU chipsets, and Sony and Microsoft, they have incredible foresight into the company's roadmap, like the public roadmap that we have access to, and the details that we get access to. Even the leaked ones is like bupkis compared to what let's say Sony or Microsoft get access to. They have access for multiple generations in the future. In many cases they can actually suggest features or problems or whatever. For example, on the desktop, AMD obviously are creating desktop GPUs, and this can also be a thing where they have to work with Nvidia and AMD for new features. For example, DirectX Ultimate for the PC, well, it started on PC and obviously got then transitioned to the desktop, to consoles. But Nvidia, of course, were pushing things like ray tracing. And then this was first implemented with stuff like the Turing, what was it called, the Vulkan extensions. And this was like all Nvidia stuff, and of course Nvidia were working at the time with Microsoft to make this part of the API. And yeah, basically what I'm saying is all of these studios, all of the companies, they all work together to kind of push standards forward. And yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the next generation. As for PlayStation 6 and Activision, it's going to be very interesting, honestly, whether this merger goes through or not. I genuinely do not know at this point. Like, I have not been following it enough, so I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts are on this and if you think it's a good idea or not. Because again, I'm going to plead ignorance. I've been, reading the odd highlight here or there as it pops up on Twitter, or I sometimes get linked stuff, the big stuff. But I haven't been following it on a day-to-day basis, so I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts are on it. With that said, take care of yourselves, guys. Bye for now.